Okay, cool. So welcome to today. Today we will be talking about CSS layouts. So if it's your first time here, welcome. The idea is that we're doing these every 2 weeks to learn some HTML, some CSS, so some programming concepts, and try to take advantage of these quarantine time. So just to give a little recap about what we've been doing up until now, we first started looking at HTML. So if you think of programming as sort of a house, we have this HTML, which is sort of the building blocks of building this house. It's the walls, the columns, the ceiling. But of course, no one wants to live here, right? So because of that, we need some styling to our house. And this is where CSS comes in. So CSS is how we're going to grab those elements, those columns and those walls, and we're going to paint them. We're going to put some nice rocks to it, some bricks, and we're going to make it look like a nice place to be in. And up until now, what we've been building looks a bit like this, right? So I have my face, I have some information about me, a call to action button, some social media sites, an introductory text, some cards about the hobbies I'm into, and then a nice footer. And this is a perfect website, right? But the thing is that once we've started applying some design to it, we're missing still the layout. So we're missing having these inlined, we're missing stuff right next to the other. And so in order to really push that forward as a design that we want, we have to start getting into layouts. Now, this is an example of our webpage in Admios. And what you can see is that we have different types of layouts. So first we have the nav bar, in which we have a list with different items right next to the other. And then we have a title, we have some cards, and then we have some text, right? Now this text we can see is justified to the left, this text is put in the middle. And what you see around these are those divs. Now, I don't know if you remember last class, but we were talking about how we can grab all of these different HTML elements and wrap them into specific divisions for each, so that inside of it, we can put the elements that we want and arrange them within their own specific sections. Now, this can seem, it seems all right? Like I have all these elements, I want to put them together. But surprisingly, when we're talking about coding, this is actually a lot harder than it seems. But why, right? Why is it so hard to position elements in a screen? Number one, responsiveness. And if you look at the data today, I think it's a percentage of something like 70% of people that are seeing websites in their phones. And so that means that whenever you're designing a site, you need to take into account the different sizes of the screens of the devices in which your users will be seeing your website. And so if we're talking about 20 pixels or 30 pixels, these 30 pixels are going to look different in a phone screen, whereas we're talking about tablets or we're talking about desktops. So because of these differences, then we got to be more flexible than just stating specific pixels for each element. We got to talk about percentages. We got to talk about dynamic layouts. And that's actually the second reason why it's so hard, because each element will be different, and it may be different across time. So for example, right now I only have 3 nice hobbies, but what if tomorrow I have 4 or 7 or 10? I want my layout to keep working on all of my devices, but I'm not quite sure of the amount of items I will have inside. And so because I want my layout to be dynamic and to be responsive, I get into a point where there is no one size fits all solution. So it depends on what I'm doing, where I'm doing, what I'm doing, and why. Then we'll start seeing different strategies to arrange our items within our screen. Now, what are these different strategies? So last class, we ended seeing divs and how we could make sure that these items have a breathing air of their own, right? So if, for example, we're talking about a button where I'm saying, call me, right? Or send me an email, we can have that as the content. So the content will be the text. And then around it, we'll have a border. And this border will have different space between the text and the border of that item, depending on how much padding we set around it. So we have a content that has a width and height. We have a padding, which is the breathing air between the text and the border of that button. And then we have the margin, which is the space that we'll have around that specific element and the next element surrounding it. Now, this seems all right, right? Why wouldn't this work when we're talking about different sizes of screens? And usually the problem here is that we'll be talking about specific numbers. And it's that problem that I was mentioning before, where if my margin is 20 pixels, well, 20 pixels in a small screen versus in my computer screen might look very different. And so because developers started facing this issue more and more often, in 2010, 2012, Flexbox came to the rescue. So what is Flexbox and why is it so powerful? As the name suggests, it allows for flexibility for our boxes. And it's honestly as easy as just applying flex to the specific container item which we want to apply it to. So in this specific example, our first step to just get Flexbox running is making sure that the items that we have inside of our Flex container are displaying in Flex mode. And just like that, we should be able to see some magic. So let's see that in code so we can see what we're talking about. If you guys remember, the way we set up our code is that we grab it and just we can hover it over our text editor and we should immediately see our code to the left. So if I go into my HTML document, if you remember, we had first our initial div, even before that, we have the head and the body, which are the main two components that are needed for every index, for every HTML document. And then inside of it, we might have a big division container, which is the one containing everything. And then we have our introduction, we have our social media division, we have our about me, our hobbies, and then the footer. So if I want to see that in the browser, I can just go into my folder, select my HTML document, and immediately we'll see our piece of art in the browser. So right now, this is what we have. We've been playing with creating these different sections and adding different items inside of it, but this still looks a bit off, right? I think everyone would like to see at least these babies be in one line. And really, this is where Flex becomes powerful. Because if I go into my code and I select, for example, my hobbies division, and let's say I give it a Flex class, and then I go into my styles file and I say to my Flex class, and remember, because it's a class, we want to call it with the dot in the beginning. So I say to that Flex class container, please display Flex. And so at that moment, if we refresh, nothing happens. And I wanted to show you this specifically because Flex is always dependent upon the Flex items that are inside of it. So check this out. Right now, Flex is my main container, but inside that container, I only have one item, which is my unordered list.
You are not sharing the right window.
Sorry? Oh, are you guys not seeing my code? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. So thank you for letting me know. Are you seeing my code now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, awesome. Thank you. That's good to know. So were you guys able to see the code from before, or is this the first time you're seeing the?
No, we couldn't see the one from before.
Okay, awesome. Good to know. So I'll go through it a bit again. But basically what I've done is that to my hobbies division, I added the Flex class. And so when I added the Flex class here, I went into my style CSS and I just added the display Flex property that we saw in the slides. And by doing that, we should expect the elements inside of it to have some behavior, but somehow it didn't. And the reason for that is because Flex will always impact the Flex items that it has inside. So at the moment, inside of our Flex container, the only element that we have is a unordered list, which inside of it has tons of list items. But the only item that Flex will see is an unordered list. What that means is that if I want to impact the list items, then that means that I got to pass my Flex property to the unordered list so that each list item will get impacted by that property. So when I refresh now, nice, we see that all of our elements are inline. So this is really important because when we're thinking of Flex, we have to think of things in terms of container and the items that are living inside of it. And a good way to think about it, I think, is this picture, right? So I have my main container, which would be our unordered list in this case. And then inside of it, we'll have different Flex items. And as we saw, the main axis will be the horizontal one because that's the default behavior of Flex. You see that by just adding display Flex, it immediately grabs its main axis and takes it as the default behavior. But of course, if we wanted to do some cross-axis as well, that also exists, and we'll be playing with that in a few seconds. Now, if I go and I see my beautiful items here, they're still looking a bit together. It's not looking nice. So I want to find a way so that they're displayed one right next to the other with some space in between. And thankfully, Flex also allows us to do that. So what we can do is that we do a justify content with a space between. And when I reload, nice. Now I immediately have them one after the other. Now, but this is still too much space. So rather than space between, I can pass a space around. And when I do that, now it just adds some space around each of them within the division that it's living in and makes sure that it's dynamic. Now, this is all very nice and fun, right? We have them displayed inline, we have them displayed as we want them. But what happens if I add a whole other set of different images, right? Now, instead of having 3 hobbies, I will have 6. And if I do this, ooh, they're all right next to the other. So actually, let's add in 3 more, and we shall see what happens. Now they're all right next to the other, sticking all together, which is of course not what we want. And this goes a bit into contradiction with what we were talking about before of having our design and our layouts be dynamic. And so the reason why this is happening is because Flexbox is always acting within the boundaries of that given container. And this means that if we want them to wrap or just go underneath for the next time, for the next row, whenever it doesn't fit anymore, we have to pass a flex wrap property. So what I can do is I can do flex wrap, please wrap all my items, so that when I do a reload, now I have them go underneath. And if I change my sections to be a bit smaller, let's say 70%, and I reload, they'll still be underneath. And so you see our Flexbox is making sure that our design is swifting and acting accordingly to how many items we want. And that is the real beauty of adding something like Flexbox onto our layouts. Now, any questions up until here? No. Okay, we'll carry on then. So now let's say that I want to check out how my website looks in my phone. So that whenever my users are using my phone, seeing my website through their phone, I want to see what layout comes up. So if let me just move the faces. If if you see what I did, I just went into my inspect element mode, and I grabbed this little icon over here, which lets me see my website in different types. So different types of devices. So if I go in here and I say, I want to see it with an iPhone 6, I'll see how my site looks on my phone. And I can see that this looks sort of bunked up together, right? If I'm imagining having my phone, it looks like small, it's crampy. It doesn't look exactly the way I would want it. Maybe I want this whole white thing to disappear and just have the screen be widened so that all of my elements fit in a nicer way. And these types of situations is when media queries become incredibly useful. Now, before we get into any details in media queries, it's important to note that they're basically doing exactly what they're telling you. It's a media query, right? So I'm saying, what type of device do I have? What size is their screen? Is it 600 pixels? Is it 900 pixels, 500? And then depending on that size, add me a breakpoint right there and query me only the styles for that given screen size. Now, how does that look like in code? What we're going to be seeing as we move forward is how these different breakpoints act upon our site. So the way to do it is to just add @media, which is responding, hey, CSS, get my media queries. Whenever you have the minimum width of a screen of 600 pixels, only then apply me these sets of rules. So that if I select this text, oh, I can't. Okay, cool. I'll just write them. So that if I go in here and I say @media, minimum width of, let's say, 500 pixels, then I want, for example, my section class, which is the one that is in each of my different divisions, right? It's the one that is actually giving me that white background color, that 70% of my screen. It's giving the border radius so that it has those nice little corners. This section class is the one really giving that look and feel to each of the different sections. And I'm going to say that whenever we have a minimum width of 500, then make that section, for example, and we'll do something very radical here, have a background color of pink. Which means that now, if I reload, because my screen is 414, and as I grow, it'll change. And when it crosses, you see that when it crosses the breakpoint of 500, that's when it turns pink. So having that in your brain, that means that we can add in tons of these different styles depending on the screen size that we want to be adapting to. And this is very important because as the world moves more towards seeing our websites in mobile, we need to make sure that we're actually designing for mobile first. And I mentioned this because look at what's happening now. After 500, it turns pink, and then it just never turns back. And the reason for that is because we're not passing another media query that's then taking care of the next bigger screen. Which means that really when we're designing our code, we want to make sure that the bunch of the code that we're inputting for the design is designed for mobile. And then we start adding those breakpoints as our website is seen on bigger screens. So that, for example, if I add in another media query, I add in another media query with a min width of 900, which should be a bit bigger than a tablet, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see if I do iPad. Oh, yeah, a bit bigger than a tablet. We can actually do 7. Let's do that measure instead. So 768. Then I can say that for all my sections at that point, please turn white again. And when I go in here, I'll see that it's pink. It's white, then it turns pink for iPads, and then as we get in bigger, oh, this will change. What did I miss? Oh, I wrote it wrong. Min width. Yep, and then now it turns bigger, and it changes again, and back and forth. Now, for something like color, it doesn't really make much sense. It's not something you would do. But if we're talking about the size, for example, if I say that the width of that section it shouldn't be that 50 or 70% part of my screen. I want it to be the entire screen of my iPhone. Then I would say that it should be, the width should be 100%. But as my screen gets bigger, then it shouldn't be 100%, it should be 70%. And then as it gets the biggest, then it shouldn't be 70%, it should be 50%. And that way, when I get into my site, and I start small, when it starts at 500, it takes the entirety of the screen. And we can see that my hobbies are well aligned within that space. And as I get bigger, then it turns into 70%. And as I get bigger, then it turns into 50%. Oh, maybe that's already 50%. Yeah. So you see that this can be very handy when we're trying to adapt our design to the different types of devices that we'll be seeing. Now, if you want to check out where to find all of these measurements, and I'll share on the chat, I'll share on the chat the website in which I've added some resources so that you can see all that we've done throughout this class, and where you can see all the different resources to find this information. But if I just type in media queries, I should immediately in my response find tons of examples, but actually this is a fairly good one where we can see the different ones. So first it says, yes, definitely design for mobile first. And it'll see, well, if you're talking about desktop, we're usually dealing with at least a minimum width of 768. If we're talking about mobile phones, if we're talking about tablets, if we're talking about desktops, and we can go on seeing all the different breakpoints that we can have for a given design. And aside from those three different types of layouts that we've discussed today, there's also Bootstrap Grid, which grabs our elements into columns. So for example, if this is our site, we could go in and add in 12 columns, and basically our code will look a bit like this. So we'll be playing with how we can move our elements to cover three columns of our screen or 4 columns of a screen, and start playing in that sort of strict measurement. Otherwise, if we're doing CSS Grid, which is the most modern one, then we can adapt it as well as different fractions of a screen. The float layout, which is deprecated, don't go there if you don't need to, or even table layout, which same advice, it would be just making a table in your HTML, and then making sure that each element covers a certain amount of rows, a certain amount of columns, and it can very fast get very complicated and unresponsive. But aside from those, I'm sure there are tons of other ones online. Layouts is a big topic when it comes to design and designing websites. It can get very complex, very fast. So what I've added for the website today, if you wanna check it out and do some of the fun stuff we've been working on, I added some resources for you to play and practice. So this Flexbox Frog is actually one of my favorite ones. It forces you to move frogs across the pond. So it says, if I want to make this frog move to this leaf, then I gotta do something like justify content flex end, and then do next and see if that moves it. Yes, moving on to my next spot. And it has tons of different levels like that. It can get very fun. There's also Flexbox Defense, which is pretty similar, but in terms of you're defending your position with the different enemies, so that can also be nice. And then I've also added some extra resources for playing with CSS Grid and some other types of layouts as well. So having that said, that is for today. If you have any questions, I'm very open to answering anything you might be curious about, if I went too fast or something that you want to see over again. Nope. Well, having that said, great meeting you guys again today in this space. And if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me or to our Admios account, and we'll be more than happy to help you out. And make sure to go check out the website and just look over through some stuff, see if you can build your own, add some fun layouts to the code you've been working on. And then we definitely want to check out all the projects that you guys are involved in. Have a nice night, guys.